Good afternoon and welcome to the third and final session in the Goal 17 Partners Japan Sustainability Discussion Series. My name is Gavin Dixon, Director and Co-founder of Global Perspectives with my business partner Tova Kinowoka, and it has been a great honour to collaborate with Goal 17 Partners to bring this series to life. Yesterday, we had a great session discussing sustainable business in the post-pandemic Asia, with input from corporates from Korea and Japan, as well as the United Nations University. And this morning, we had a really enlightening session on women in the workforce and how the pandemic has impacted gender equality, with voices coming from the private sector here in Japan, as well as the United Nations, the Gates Foundation, and the OECD. And to round out the series in this final session, The Future of Work in a Socially Distanced World, we will aim to explore what all of our future working lives might look like and how that is linked to a sustainable future. All of these sessions will be available to watch online, and you can access them through the Goal 17 Partners website or the Global Perspectives website. Just a little bit of background on Goal 17 Partners. It's a non-profit organisation that was formed about 4 years ago with the deep support of Guggenheim Partners. Through both practical workshops and thought leadership events like this one, Goal 17 Partners has the aim of engaging and activating the corporate sector in the achievement of the United Nations SDGs. Over the next year, we look forward to working with Goal 17 Partners to bring you other events like this around the UN Climate Action Summit, which will be online in September, the World Economic Forum early next year, which will be both online and potentially a little bit in person. And finally, we are looking to build a series of major events around next year's Tokyo Olympics. So with our introductions completed, I'd like to hand over to today's moderator, Takuji Okubo. Now, he has a great long job title here, North Asia Director for the Economist Corporate Network at the Economist Intelligence Units. Tak, please go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you all the panelists for joining, and thank you all the audience for your time. So the theme of this session for the next 1 hour is the future of work in a socially distant world, or the future of work in a post-COVID or post-pandemic in Japan, as well as in the rest of the world. And we have 3 panelists to join me in discussing the topic. We have Vijay, the president of Enworld, one of the largest executive search and HR consulting company in Japan. And we have Kai-san from UN. She's the head of office at the UN Women Liaison Office in Japan. And we have Anna Marie from Kao Corporation. She's the director of corporate culture. So it's great to have all of you. And without further ado, let's kick off the discussion. So the title, The Future of Work in Social Distance World, I guess work could mean a number of things. It could be workplace, it could be the way we do work, it could be the people. But I think we will probably be focusing on the people, how, or talent, how COVID-19 or social distancing affects the way people work, what kind of talent is now required in this new world. And I think, panelists and I had one preparatory session, and we'll be focusing on first, what kind of skills are now required in the workforce. So that's one discussion we'll be having, and secondly, we'll be moving on to the requirement of communication. I think given we are socially distancing, for example, in this, it's difficult to communicate. Everybody is 2D, so it's difficult for employer and employee to communicate. It's difficult to have a community in a company culture. So that's a second topic. So how we can manage to communicate in this socially distanced world. That's the second topic we would be discussing. And the third topic, I will be focusing on the woman or the female. And I think that's pretty much Kaya's dominant area. But we will be discussing how the COVID-19 is affecting the role female play in Japan's corporate culture as well as in society, both positive as well as negative side. So that would be the three topics we'll be covering in the next 1 hour. So, but first to kick off, let me go to Vijay. So it'll be great to hear your views on what kind of skills, attributes are now more important than used to be in the socially distanced world. Vijay?
Yeah, thank you, Tak. Hi, everyone. Glad to be joining this webinar and looking forward to the discussion here. Yeah, we talked about this a little bit yesterday. I think, there's certain skill sets and types of experience that are going to be more sought after, more highly valued by companies going forward post-COVID, or while the pandemic is still with us. There are things that have still been important and still been sought after pre-COVID, but I think COVID has amplified this need, and it's accelerated companies in terms of moving to business models or to working styles that take advantage of or require certain skill sets. And I think the real key kind of buzzwords that you hear or categories that you hear about that companies want or that people are trying to develop themselves in, they all center around communication, dealing with change, infrastructure, and anything digital. So when I say those things, I mean, we're in a world now where communicating is different. People aren't necessarily sitting next to their colleague, and that makes communication more difficult. So those people with stronger communication skills who can still, work constructively and communicate constructively, both with their colleagues and with customers who, you won't necessarily be visiting their offices and they won't necessarily be visiting your offices as frequently, is going to be super, super important. So I think that the communication one would be the first category that is the biggest. The second one I mentioned when I say, transformation or dealing with change or dynamic type of, situations, COVID is probably the most extreme example of that at least I've experienced in my career. But there's always going to be change, and there will be other things in the future that disrupt businesses, that cause the market to change, and people who have experience leading companies through that type of situation, leading changes, developing agile workforces, developing agile business models. Again, those are going to be the ones that come to the forefront and are more competitive. So those types of skills, particularly in leadership, are going to be more and more important, I think. The other one I mentioned was anything digital, anything web related, both from an internal perspective and how a company's employees are working. So many companies have had to quickly shift to remote working styles. The companies that have had a good infrastructure to allow people to work virtually are the ones who've had an easier time doing that. That's not going to change. Now that people have experience working in a more flexible way, working remotely, there's going to be more companies that continue to do that. And it's going to be a real important element of a company in terms of attracting and retaining talent, that they're able to facilitate that type of working style. So that's super important. But not only on the internal side, in terms of how companies do business and from a commercial perspective, those companies that have a better e-commerce platform, who have better digital marketing, those companies that can reach their customers, again, without having to sit in their office physically, or who can provide a platform where their customers can buy from them without having to visit their store or meet their consultants, are the ones that are going to be more competitive again, and are going to gain market share and do well in business. So I think those are probably the main highlights I would want to mention.
Thank you, Vijay. So communications, agility or ability to transform or change or adapt to the new situation, and also ability to perform in a digital in a digital setting. So Anna Marie, so you work for a for-profit company, a Japanese company. So I think in terms of agility, digital, so we will talk about communication in the second in the second part. But let's focus on agility, so ability to change, and the ability to perform in a digital corporate world. I have a sense that Japanese company or Japanese may not be too good at it. At least that has been the perception. So what do you think about this topic? And and regardless, what can company do? What, especially like Japanese company do to help their employee adapt to the new situations?
Yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and that's an excellent question. I agree very strongly with Vijay's points, and I especially think that the communications piece, leadership communication, communicating through change is a core part of it. But to respond directly to your question, Takuji, about Japanese companies being able to change. So I think that Japanese companies maybe have a bit of a bad reputation in the world for being slow, for being resistant to change, for being quite process oriented. So that's not incorrect, but one thing that I have noticed, especially working at Kao Corporation, which is a very large company, we're a global business, we have more than 30,000 employees. So we are a large Japanese company, and of course we are slow to change in some respects, but as the COVID pandemic took root, and of course as we all started to work from home and face very dramatic disruptions to our working styles, I was actually really impressed with what I guess I could say the secret agility or the hidden agility of a lot of my coworkers. And I think it comes from two factors. They're strong at Kao, but I think they're generalizable, or they're shared among a lot of Japanese companies. And the first is a shared set of values or a shared philosophy. Japanese companies, especially companies with long histories, generally have very, very strong core philosophies, and it usually comes from the founder in many cases. And in our case at Kao, we have really strong shared philosophy called Kao Way. And that served really as a cornerstone for people to come back to when, you know, it used to be you got on the train and you went to work, and then suddenly you were told stay home for the next couple of months. Facing disruptions like that, I noticed a lot of my coworkers would come back to our shared philosophy and our mission, and okay, well, what are we here to do as a business? And now that we can't use our usual tools and working processes, how do we find new ways to achieve the same goal? So that's one thing. I think that shared philosophy is actually not very well recognized, but very strong driver of agility in Japanese businesses. And the second point that I'm sort of observing as this pandemic goes on a little bit longer, I've sort of picked up on it, is that large Japanese companies, or Japanese companies in general, have quite unique human capital development practices. So people join a company generally out of university and stay there for their whole careers. And people go through rotations every couple of years. In most companies, it's January and July, and suddenly the whole organization just shifts. And people move, they do developmental rotations, so they might move from marketing to procurement or whatever. And so they're used to moving around the company, still within the same organization, but taking on a completely different role and being told, like, you know, 3 months later, you're moving to procurement when you have no idea what procurement's all about. And so a lot of people actually do have experience of adapting to a new working environment, new coworkers, new job function. And I think that's been a latent strength for us, for a lot of Japanese companies, in that we are, you know, obviously we're not used to facing global pandemics, but we are used to, as an organization, just entering some field that you know nothing about and figuring it out as you go along. So those are two sort of positive surprises that I've noticed in my large Japanese company, at least in terms of agility.
Indeed, I think you pointed out a very interesting point. So Japanese company, although they are kind of renowned for being slow to change, you pointed out the people inside the organization, they're actually used to having a different role every couple of years. So as an organization, Japanese company could actually be quite agile and adaptive. So Kae, so let me come to you. So I do understand you are the head of UN Women, but then you're also in Japan working in a more of a public sector. So I think public sector again is not necessarily known for agility and being able to work in a digital, maybe digital, but then in a sense of picking up new skills. So, well, I'm just playing the devil's advocate, and you're happy to say no, I'm wrong. But what do you think about actually you're in a public role and you have a distinguished career in a UN, and UN. I have a lot of respect for UN, but you know, some people might think public organizations are slow to change. How do you say? What do you say to these views?
Thank you, and thank you again for having me in this very important conversation. You know, just to make some clarification that yes, the UN in general and UN Women in particular that I belong to, work both public and private sectors. And in fact, the existence and presence of the private sector has increased dramatically in the last decade or so. So we work on both sectors. In terms of ability to adapt in a public sector, I suppose we live in this one world where public and private are, the division has become very blurry. That, for example, the achieving SDGs cannot be done without the private sector efforts, and therefore, even if the public sector is being slow and resistant to the change, we have no choice but to change, because our counterpart, our partner, is changing so rapidly that we are almost like it's not forced, but we are asked to change as well. And so I think being a public sector, yes, there has been a lot of bureaucracies and challenges for sure. But in this world, in today's world, I think we are all to change.
Okay. Can you describe what one thing your organization is doing, which shows like agility and ability to adapt to the digital? And actually, I can ask the same question for Vijay and Anna Marie. But any good practices you have been practicing in terms of agility and being digital? Maybe Kai? Yeah.
Sure. For example, this very format setting, the Zoom meeting, is something that we didn't have before. But once the COVID-19 hit us, we immediately adopted to do this. And trust me, being the UN and being the bureaucracy, that adopting a new sort of system, communication system as such, Zoom, is not an easy one. And of course, there's always the information security issues involved, but we have adopted that. And it's not related necessarily to the digital change, but because of this whole change of working method, we immediately adopted this work from home policies, where working hours is not rigidly set anymore. We have adopted a changed evaluation system where we're not sort of assessing people for physical hours that they're working, but more like a result oriented. So there are several things. No doubt COVID-19 is a challenge to humankind, but also I think it has shed quite a light on possibilities to change.
Thank you. So maybe I can come back to Anne-Marie. So any example, it could be inside Kao, it could be just some practices you observe outside Kao, which shows that agility and ability to adapt to digital in your company or outside your company.
Well, I mean, in terms of ability to adapt to digital, we have adapted actually very quickly. So we had a work from home program in place before the pandemic, but it was restricted to people looking after young children or elderly relatives. And then when it was applied to everyone, I was impressed by how carefully and diligently all my coworkers studied how to use digital tools. And I think this is not a cultural gap as much as it's a generational gap. I will laugh, but I'm a very old millennial. So I grew up in the generation that just got used to technology and used it without reading the instruction manual. But some of my older colleagues really approached it quite diligently, invested a lot of time in like really learning how to use Teams, for example, or, what the different functions were. And so I think that willingness to learn something new and a very methodical or studious approach to it actually helped us to all, for everyone from different age groups and generations, all sort of learned how to use digital tools quite quickly. And then one other sort of example that I can share of what we've been experimenting with, at least in my department, because I'm in charge of corporate culture, and corporate culture is, well, it's quite a fuzzy thing anyway. And then when nobody's actually in the office anymore, it's really difficult to understand what is our corporate culture? How are we communicating with each other? What's the mood or the tone of the organization? So we've been experimenting with holding sort of open participation online coffee chats And we've done this in the Japan organization, and we've also done it globally, inviting a few different overseas locations to join. And we're trying to create the same sort of open atmosphere that you would have, for example, in the company coffee space, where people can just join and talk, and it's not a meeting with a set agenda, and just seeing what information we can get from these types of casual online encounters, and then what is their impact on strengthening communication. And we found so far it's actually a really useful tool in order to sort of get the pulse of your organization, channel information from the ground up. It's something that's been really useful to us, and I think will continue.
Thank you. So we are at the 20 minutes mark, so I think we can move on to the next topic. And Anne-Marie just suggested some example of communication. But Vijay, let me come to you, and can you actually explain to us again why communication is one of the paramount importance in this socially distanced world? I mean, I understand that it could be obvious, but can you elaborate?
Yeah, I think it's it's obvious because you don't have as many interactions in the office with people working from home is the biggest example. You don't have those water cooler chats when people are just happen to be walking past each other and see people that they don't necessarily have a regularly scheduled meeting with. So I think what it means is that companies and people have to be far more proactive about how they communicate. There's things that would have just happened naturally or without effort that aren't going to happen now. And if you neglect that, then there's a huge amount of communication, particularly within a company, to Anne-Marie's point about the company culture that is really lost. So again, being proactive with things like these virtual coffees, or we've done, I can't count how many virtual lunches, virtual drinks, virtual office hours sessions. Many different divisions are creating their own kind of catchphrases for how they're titling these different things, but just trying to encourage as many of these different types of interactions as possible to happen virtually, because you just have a huge amount of that communication with people being out of the office that you're going to miss out on. So yeah, I think that's really what the biggest issue is how proactive can a company be to engage that communication, to engage their employees, and to offset what they're losing by people not running into each other at the water cooler.
Okay. By the way, for the audience, so we are moving on to the first topic, the second topic. But if you do have any questions and comments for our panelists, or the point you want to make to the audiences regarding the first point, the second point, the third point, you can put in questions. There should be a Q&A box at the bottom right of your screen, or maybe it could be top right, depending on how you're accessing. But do feel encouraged to put in your questions and answers. Anne-Marie, so Vijay actually gave us a pretty good order example. He may have actually exhausted, but do you have any other example? Okay, so virtual everything, virtual breakfast, lunch, dinner, drink, virtual, water cooler. Any other ways that the company can help their employee communicate in this virtual world? I mean, it doesn't have to be. Actually, one good lucky thing about us in Japan is we are not in lockdown. So I think there are ways to set up kind of a minimum risk situation where employee could still meet. I think that's we should definitely not rule out meeting in person. But any other interesting or any example of how to enhance communications?
Well, I think one sort of silver lining or unexpectedly interesting new development for us in terms of communication is that we're a large company. Our headquarters is in Tokyo, and we tend to have communication in the global business that goes between Tokyo and country A or country B or region C or whatever. We don't have a lot of sort of communication between different regions. And I think this is the same in a lot of global organizations. It's HQ to overseas location is the primary channel. And we have, I think, just in our minds before we all got used to digital work that, you know, it's overseas business is very far away, and it's just sort of communicating with them is something extraordinary. It's sort of out of the ordinary, but now that we're all basically equally close to each other, or everyone is just like a Zoom meeting away or a couple of clicks away, what we have noticed is that we are able to accelerate communication between overseas locations. So I'm able to shift the role of HQ to facilitate. We say Gemba. Gemba just means overseas or like location. I'm able to shift the role of HQ to facilitate Gemba to Gemba communication. And that's a really interesting side benefit of the sort of collapse of distance that happens when everyone is working remote. So if I want to communicate, for example, have Singapore in one window and China in the other window and Taiwan in the other window, we're all equally distant. And I found that communication across the global organization is actually becoming slightly more active as a result of this pandemic. And I think this is probably the case for a lot of global organizations. The HQ to Gemba, Gemba to Gemba communication flow is changing in an interesting way.
Okay. So let me go to Kae. So in terms of how to enhance communication in a social distance world, any good practices, any novel ideas?
I think my previous speakers quite elaborated the things that we do at the UN, but one thing that didn't come up and I wanted to brag about it is that we had an online talent show that it's just to create the sense of family. And as Vijay and Anne-Marie said, you know, there's actually a lack of physical contact with colleagues, and we actually miss each other. Genuinely, we miss each other. And there was an initiative suggested by one of our colleagues that let's just do an online talent show that colleagues show up online with guitars and other music instruments, and look at Japan. It's big on karaoke, so maybe perhaps online karaoke session may create another sense of community here. And in terms of communication between headquarters and regions and country offices, it's our bread and butter. We have to have that communication to make sure that we address gender equality and empowerment of women in the world. So that is already given. But I think that online communication also enables us to share the information much quicker. So for example, when something is happening in Japan, it took a few weeks or a few months to reach to our country office or regional offices, but now everything is online, so they can certainly participate in a meeting like this. That's also a benefit of online communication.
Okay. Well, in terms of communication, I think one cohort of a company employee who really need a good communication is new recruits, right? So they just joined the company. I have actually met many new graduates who have been to company just one day, and for the rest stay home. So it's I think especially in Japan, we've been using a lot of like mostly on the job training, you know, from your senpai to kohai. So I think especially those new graduates could actually be the most fragile part when it comes to, you know, learning company culture. So perhaps Anne-Marie, can I come to you? How companies are trying to overcome that particular communication?
Yeah, that's a big challenge, and I think especially for large companies like us, we hire hundreds of new graduates every year, and they go through relatively long, like in HCD terms, a socialization period. So they just don't actually do any sort of productive work right away. They just get to know the company, get to know business manners, you know, how to be a business person in Japan and how to communicate, all that kind of stuff, and build relationships. And of course, they can't do any of that from their homes. So we have, I mean, of course, our human capital development department is following them up really closely, and I think paying a lot more attention than we usually do. I mean, we don't just ignore our recruits in normal times, but we're paying a lot more attention, more than we usually do, to make sure that they're okay and that they're understanding, at least to the extent that they can, the dynamics of the organization and building the relationships that they can. One thing that I have observed, of course, is that the role of new recruits direct line managers is becoming more and more important, because they don't have the sort of social support of, you know, being with a bunch of people or being actually in the company, present in the company. And so most of their communication is with their direct line manager. And so I think that for new recruits in particular, but I think especially going forward for all employees, having really good communication with your manager, and for managers being able to learn how to build trust and motivate people and fairly evaluate them remotely is going to be a hugely necessary skill going forward for Japanese companies.
Thank you. Thank you. By the way, so audience, please do, I do want to make this session as interactive as possible, obviously between the panelists, but as well as the audience and the panelists. So do feel, we need you to actually, we also like to hear from you. So please put in questions and comments. So Vijay, I am not sure if your organization recruits new graduates, fresh graduates from school, but do you, and then do you have any comments on this particular issue, communication to, new joiner to the companies?
Yeah, I mean, N-World doesn't really focus on new grad hiring. We have hired fresh graduates before, but we don't have a formalized structure of new grad hiring like a lot of big Japanese companies do. Our parent company does. But even, with people who are joining a company, whether they're a new grad or not, there still needs to be a certain element of induction so that they can understand, how the company works internally, again, get a sense of the company culture, and obviously be trained for the job that they need to do in that company. And ours is no different in that respect. And despite not hiring new grads, we also hire a lot of people without any recruitment experience or any experience in HR fields. So this is definitely a challenge for us and for all of our clients right now who are working almost 100% remotely. I think, in the long term, this is probably one of the things that will force companies to have some element of, the physical office and physical interaction, because I just don't see that it can be replaced completely by virtual or online interaction. But obviously there's a lot that can be done, online and virtually, and companies right now, are being forced to enhance their online learning systems to have more, more structured online communication with new hires. And yeah, we've had a lot of people who we've placed who have started and haven't even visited the office yet. We have new hires at N-World who I've yet to meet in person, but I've had several virtual interactions with them. So yeah, companies need to do it in a structured way. They need to be intentional about it. But in the long term, I do think there's going to be part of that can't be replaced, and physical interaction, especially for new hires and new grads, is going to be something that continues in the long term.
Okay, good. I think we could move on to the next topic. How the topic of female, how COVID-19 is posing, what kind of challenges it's posing to female workforce in Japan as well as outside Japan. And I do want to hear something positive about, maybe some catalyst for change as well. But maybe Kai, could you address this issue, how the pandemic is affecting the role female play in Japan in work, at work, probably at work, but then if you like to address also in the society as well.
Thank you. Thank you. It's certainly something that we feel very close to our heart. It's really about gender equality. And as I said, COVID-19 has been a greatest challenge, one of the greatest challenges to the humankind, but also it gave us an opportunity to rethink about the way we are and shed a light on some of the issues that we've been struggling with. And as we all UN says, always turning the crisis into the opportunity. So this is the moment where we can all come together to come up with the solutions. When you think about the COVID-19 and subsequent lockdown and physical distancing is disproportionately affecting women and girls in many ways, from concern for their health and safety to income security, to additional caring responsibilities at home and increased exposure to domestic violence. This is quite common in the world, everywhere you go in the world, and also it's the challenges that we see in Japan as well. For example, in Japan and everywhere else, women are at the front line as the healthcare workers, working long hours and exposing themselves to the risk while caring for their patients. Also, women often take more jobs in the informal sector and holding multiple part-time jobs where the compensation and safety net is really lacking. And furthermore, women tend to continue to carry the burden of care duties. In Japan, oftentimes we talk about caring for children, but let's not forget this country has a huge older elderly population, and who is taking care of those older folks? It's mostly women and also sick person. And lastly, isolation and social distancing has increased the risk of domestic violence and abuse. People may think that home is the safest place, but for some women and girls, it's not. So we really need to pay a particular attention to that. So, I mean, I can go on and on and on, but I would stop here.
Okay. Actually, so anything positive? It's all negative for it's COVID-19, or I mean, it is a disease, so I guess it's negative, but anything positive?
Sure. Thank you for reminding me that I need to also touch upon the positive side. I think the positive side is, again, to shed a light on the issues so that we can actually think to change. And one of the changes that I've seen in Japan, surprisingly, is that despite the traditional resistance, I think working remotely or teleworking has become some sort of norm in Japan, which is, I think it's a huge change, and it helps not just only women, but men to really balance their work and life. So I think that's definitely a positive change. But again, I don't want to turn this into a negative conversation either, but let's not forget, not everyone is working based in the office work. There are people, women in the factories, there are people in the retail business, mostly women, they physically have to be there. So we need to also think about how to support them in that category as well. But teleworking and remote working is something that brought some changes to a Japanese society, I think.
Right. And then Kai, actually staying with you. So in your view, so I understand the challenges and the risk to female workforce and female in general. So what can companies do? I mean, what can companies do to alleviate that problem?
Yes, absolutely. I think the flexible working method is something that really addresses challenges, both men and women. And let's not forget, what I don't want to reinforce is the stereotype of women in Japan, that as if women are the only ones who take care of children or elderly. So this flexible working hours the company would offer should be targeted both men and women. Another alleviation that we can think about is, as I said earlier, for those who are not working in a formal sector, but rather informal sector, how do we then support them in a way that maybe increased care facilities or care support the company can offer? That's another thing that company can concretely do. So even though the women are working at the store, their children are being looked after. The third thing that company can concretely do is really to prioritize using women-owned businesses and services. They are the ones who are most vulnerable in this situation. So if you have a choice to make, please do make sure that you prioritize to give business to a woman-owned owned business, or the procurement or other services that you buy from. So those are the three things that I could suggest.
Okay. So, well, I can go to either Vijay or Anne-Marie. I'd like to hear your view on this, basically plus and minuses from COVID-19 to the status of the female in Japanese work and society. Do you have any comment? Yeah, Vijay?
Yeah, I can share, because I do think there is an opportunity for some positives to come out of this. I think, with Japanese business and the Japanese labor force, there has been more women entering the labor force. The makeup of the labor force is now more proportional overall because of Abenomics or Womenomics having some positive effect, but it's still very disproportionate in the types of work that people are doing. And with women tending to be disproportionately represented in contract type of work or lower value type of work. And that's where, you know, they often maybe don't have the opportunity to work from home or work remotely. And those corporate white collar jobs are primarily held by men. And I think, you know, that is a legacy in Japan because of traditional business culture not being very flexible, both in terms of where you're working from or the hours that you're working, and women therefore being discriminated against in terms of their advancement in career because they become mothers or when they have to take care of family. It's, you know, viewed by the company as them not being able to contribute as much as a man who can work longer hours and always be in the office. I think, and there's two parts to that. I think part of it is the women not having the opportunity, but there's also a lot of surveys and a lot of studies that show that women in Japan are not as concerned about that than some of their counterparts in other countries, because the lifestyle of a Japanese salaryman is not necessarily that attractive either. Commuting a long way on a crowded train, working really long hours. So I think, you know, with a shift towards more flexible working arrangements, there's an opportunity, and I don't know if this will evolve this way, but I'm hopeful that it will, is that men have more flexibility to work from home and work in hours that allow them to get more involved in care of families. And then women see that, you know, having a career in business or in the corporate world or in, you know, professional services can also be attractive and possible to balance with, you know, family responsibilities as well, which, you know, in the past it didn't necessarily exist that way. So I think those kind of dynamics, if they evolve in the right way and Japan capitalizes on it, can really, you know, move the needle here, you know, quicker than it would otherwise have.
Yeah, I think because that the men are nowadays more working, at least in April and May, they were working from home. So I guess you know, they couldn't be out drinking and pretending to work, right? So you know, they're home and they should be able to you know, and they should be able to help out. Anna-Marie, when you see, well, I guess you have a lot of female colleagues in your company. So how do you see COVID-19 affecting your colleagues in general, and maybe also, maybe not necessarily just Kao, but in general, as you see?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, great points by Kai and Vijay for sure. And I think, I mean, if I just echo Kai's point, we must not forget that for a lot of women, home is another workplace. Home is just a place where you go do your second shift after you finished working in the office, and that, you know, looking after children, taking care of relatives, cleaning the house. A lot of that work in Japan and globally, of course, falls on women. So work and home, the distinction is different, very different for women than it is for men. And this is something that we see in so many data patterns around the world. So remembering that for a lot of women, home is another workplace is really important and can't forget. And also that home can actually be a dangerous place if you're subject to domestic violence. So cannot forget that. But one thing that I have noticed in my company for sure, and I think talking to colleagues in other Japanese companies, is that what work is visible and what work is invisible has changed quite dramatically. And when I mentioned before that we'd been running some sort of online coffee chats, and they're quite open, and we asked anybody in the company that wanted to join and just chat about, you know, what's going on with them, how they want to change their work in the future, etc. I got a lot of young male employees join, and many of them actually were holding their children while they were joining, and many people made comments such as, you know, now that I'm home all the time, I see how much work my female partner is doing. And so because a lot of Japanese men who in normal workplace culture are just gone from Monday to Friday from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m., they're at home. And so the domestic work is becoming a lot more visible for white collar or, you know, full-time male employees in Japan. That's really interesting. And then the second thing, and I'm speaking from my position as a manager in a Japanese company, managing a remote team, is that I can't see what they're doing all the time. It used to be, you know, we'd be in the traditional Japanese office environment with the bucho's desk at one, and then all of the employees' desks in front of the bucho. So he or she could see, a bucho is director or division head, so he or she could see who was working, quote unquote working, who was there and who wasn't. You can't anymore. I don't know what my team is doing. All I see is the results. And so it's very interesting now that what used to be extremely visible all the time, which is what people are doing during the regular working day, I can't see that anymore. So normal, the tendency in a lot of Japanese companies is to evaluate people's performance based on input, how many hours they work, whether they look busy or not in the office. You cannot do that anymore. That's become invisible. And so evaluating based on output, because now that's relatively, it's the only thing that many managers are relatively able to see. I hope that that does kickstart the trend to change performance evaluation in Japanese companies. And then going back to my first point, I think that now that a lot of domestic work has become visible to male white collar Japanese workers, I hope that that will change the division of labor in the home going forward.
And actually, and you already see that change happening? You see like male maybe sharing that that they're actually getting to do more, more housework and cooking.
Yeah, and people have actually, I mean, I'm not sure how long it will last, but many people have said they actually enjoy being able to spend time with their families, get better at housework, spend more time with their children. And I think it's because it's our industry, we make a lot of household cleaning products. And so a lot of people are actually really excited to see, how Japanese people are doing housework. We're getting a lot of market insights through our daily work experience. But no, I do think that the mirror point of a lot of Japanese women, going back to what Vijay said about not thinking that a career is an attractive life choice, because the stereotype is that it might involve, working long hours, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, there's a lot of Japanese men for whom that's not attractive either. And a lot of Japanese men would like to be more involved with their home and their families. And this is backed up by lots and lots of data and surveys. And I think that if we can change the way that Japanese men work, allow them to spend more time with their families, be more involved, that's going to change how Japanese women, first of all, see what is possible for them in their careers. And second of all, it's going to make that possible because they'll have more support on the domestic front.
Okay. So I do see one comment and one question in the Q&A box. So we have 14 minutes to go. So I think I would actually wait for maybe one or more questions to accumulate, and we will get to that. So I wanted to talk about, I wanted to actually discuss with you on like the generational change. I think, we shouldn't just stereotype Japanese household. I think attitude regarding relationship between husband and wife, relations within a family must be different if they are in 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Do you think that is or maybe there are people who says actually Japanese household, I mean, it's actually more depending on like regional, like okay, this is again stereotype, people from Kyushu area I think they tend to be more, I don't know, discriminatory against women. So do you see any big difference within Japan regarding this male-female balance? Maybe I can go to Kae. Geography, generations, and how company policy should be different depending on the age of the employees. Any views, Kae-san?
Sure. Definitely, there's a generation difference in terms of perceptions. That for sure. I wouldn't go for regional differences because that would be really a stereotyping. But I'm glad that we're talking about stereotype because if I could just be a little bit selfish to sort of blow our own horn, stereotyping is a big challenge to gender equality, and that's why UN Women has started this initiative called Unstereotype Alliance with corporate partners to make sure their advertisement, for example, is going to be very gender positive, so that we are not enforcing the stereotype of women being the housewife or men being the 24 hours working salaryman kind of thing. So stereotype is a huge issue that we are addressing right now. And for any audience listening right now to join this alliance in Japan, please do contact me. So sorry, I had to throw that back in there.
Thank you. Hey, Vijay, any views on like difference between generation. I guess we don't need to go to a geographical change differences, but maybe we can stick to a generation. Any views on how you view your friends in 30s, 40s, 50s? Is there a big change are they like a Japanese couple in their 20s, 30s? Are they behaving very differently than people in 50s, 60s?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I'm really an expert on trying to answer that question, but I think, you know, there's definitely generational differences. You know, people who grew up in you know, the 60s and 70s are going to be think about the world differently than people who grew up in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. And, you know, I think younger people who grew up with technology, who, you know, even younger than me, who grew up with, you know, smartphones their entire life, you know, have an easier time adopting and adjusting to new technologies and new ways of behaving that are influenced by those technologies. So I think that's certainly a trend. I would say, you know, when it comes to things like stereotypes or equality in the workplace, you know, I do work with several young Japanese women, and I think they, to me, seem to be more proactive, or at least more outspoken than Japanese women my age or older, who grew up in a different, you know, corporate environment and maybe, you know, weren't encouraged to speak up and try to change the workforce makeup. So I don't want to say anything negative about Japanese women my age or older. I'm sure, you know, had they had worked in the environment that we have now, they would have been just as vocal. But I do think I do see a lot of you know, proactivity and young Japanese women starting to raise their hand, raise their voice to you know, take a more prominent role in influencing how companies work and, you know, how the workforce will evolve.
Okay, thank you. So Anne-Marie, so well, sticking to a generation. So in terms of where companies should focus on, should company feel okay, they can just leave couple in 20s and 30s, you know, they figure out, but then maybe 40s, 50s, they're more rigid against change. Maybe they're more threatened by the COVID-19. Is there any that kind of generational issue there in your company, or?
Yeah, so I mean, if I can just touch a little bit on the regional thing, because this is super interesting to me. The Government Cabinet Gender Equality Office puts out data on women's participation in the workforce broken down by prefecture in Japan. And if you look at the rates, it's not like attitudes of discrimination or anything, it's just how many women are working. There's huge variation, internal variation in Japan, and some parts of Japan, I think it's Fukui Prefecture, women's labor force participation is the same as Sweden. And then other parts, it's really, really low. And so the national average in Japan is what it is, but then there's huge regional variation. So that's a really interesting statistic. I think that there's certain things that Japan can learn from Japan about women in the workforce, but that's a little bit of a side digression. So to answer your question directly about generational differences, well, I think for any company, it's really important to understand the needs and the opinions and the mindsets of your talented employees in their 20s and 30s, because they're the future of your company. You want to retain the talented employees in that age range. And one statistic or one number that we look at really carefully is, I don't know what it is in English, in Japanese, kizoku ishiki, which is like intention to remain with a company. So there's a lot of data available that asks the question, do you plan to leave your company in the next 3 years or the next 5 years or whatever? And then if you look at how many people say yes to that question who are in their 20s and 30s, it just goes up and up and up and up every year. So one thing that you can definitely say in terms of generational differences is that older Japanese people don't intend to quit. And it may be because of life stage, I'm not sure, but younger Japanese people, more and more of them intend to change companies in the next 3 or 5 years. And if you need to retain your talented employees in their 20s and 30s, you should really pay attention to that statistic. And I think long-term, the Japanese labor market will become more active. Vijay, you'll definitely want to say something about this. There's going to be more mobility in the Japanese labor market, and talented people in their 20s and 30s will have more and more options for where to go. And I think that for the younger generation, work-life balance, or being a company that offers flexible working, balanced and fair performance evaluation, gender equality, diversity, et cetera, that's going to be a huge retention driver. And I think it's super important to be paying attention to. And the companies that are thinking about it now are starting off ahead. In about 5 years, there's going to be no company in Japan that can't afford to think about retention of their younger employees.
Thank you. So let's turn to a question. So we have we have one comment from Ryo Satsukawa-san. So I think it's he. Forgive me if I'm mistaken, but he's saying that in terms of recruitment, new graduates management, it's just that supervisor have catch up with a new recruit every day. Just a constant communication, there's intensive focus on, especially on new graduates. I guess that helps. So there's a question. So to the panelists, how do you ensure the balance between the expectation of productivity while also giving employee the freedom to not be always connected or always online? So how do you ensure your team member remain productive while being online and being given the freedom what to work? Any takers?
I'm happy to take a shot at that
please.
one. We've actually done a survey on a number of our clients who've moved to more remote or flexible working styles and asked them, how has the productivity changed? And the majority of them said productivity has not changed for the better or the worse. But of those who said it had changed, more of them said it actually improved productivity to have more flexible working arrangements. So I really think, it is an old-fashioned way of thinking that you need to monitor how many hours somebody is putting into a job to determine, their performance. I think Anna Marie touched on it earlier. This is happening more in the West for a long time, I think, but Japan will need to shift towards a more output-oriented evaluation system. So I think the way to ensure performance and productivity is that you reward people and you evaluate them on their performance and their productivity rather than their hours that they're sitting in front of a computer, which might actually be quite inefficient overall. So I think that's a very general way that I look at it.
Thank you. So, we are targeting to finish on the dot. So we have 2 minutes left. So let me actually try to wrap up. So in this session, we discussed 3 topics. Okay, what are the key skills, attributes required for employees in this new world? We talked about communication. We talked about agility. We talked about willingness to learn new skill, especially the digital ones. I think that were the topic. We move on to the communication. I think there is no silver bullet in terms of fixing this communication problem. I think we should always try to experiment, but then I think just always remembering you need to communicate and try to have as much opportunity as possible to communicate between the team, boss and the team, or within a team member. And I think Kae remind us it's always good to have some fun, virtually. I think it's also important. And the third, we did discuss about how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting the female workplace. So obviously there are many challenges. She touched on especially the topic of domestic violence. I think that's very it's something companies should definitely be aware of, because it's often not visible from outside. But we did talk about maybe Japan could use the COVID-19 crisis as kind of a good catalyst. Well, now that all the Japanese company, many Japanese companies are, at least on surface, they are able to let employee work from home. I think that itself should be friendly to mothers and those people, and those not just actually, no, it shouldn't be just for mothers. And actually that's exactly the point Kae was making. it should also be friendly to fathers, you know, who want to spend more time with the family doing housework. So I think that's, so I mean, there's always some silver lining to any crisis. So somebody said, you know, never let the crisis go to waste. I think that's something Japan, you know, it'd be great if Japan can turn this crisis into a good crisis for in the medium to long term. So that's my wrap up. And I think with that, I think we could conclude this session. Gavin, should I hand it over to you, or should I conclude as it is? Yeah. Okay. So I think it's time. So thank you, all the panelists for joining, and thank you very much for participants. And it'd be great if you could give applause to all the panelists. It was great to meet you. I very much enjoyed the discussion, and I hope you did too. And thank you, and have a nice rest of the day. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.